and thank you for coming tonight. We've had a delay with my accompanist, so we're doing things a little bit out of order and being a little flexible with that, but I'm glad that you're all here. And so musical examples for those of you that have never been to a lecture recital, I play and I talk. So we will start playing when my accompanist arrives, and until then, I will start lecturing. So my topic is lessons from hymns, and I chose this because I wanted to inform my classical performance as a classical violist through my experience with hymns and finding out what audience members experienced with them. The reason that I chose this is because there are a lot of challenges as a performing artist, but my biggest challenge has been being able to connect with my audience. That's because in order to connect with an audience, it requires you to have a personal and universal sound. So you need to have something that is personal to you, something that's convincing, but that can speak to a large group of people at the same time. And you may ask, why is that a difficult thing? You've been studying viola for a very long time, which is true. If you take a look at what my current training has been, I've spent countless hours practicing and countless time perfecting in a practice room. That's a very solitary activity, and not much of that time is spent with me thinking about anything other than the music I'm playing and making it sound good. I've also had countless hours in general music education, meaning I've had music history, I've had music theory, I've had sight singing, aural skills, and orchestra, and spent lots of time doing that. I've also had great mentoring from incredible teachers. But what has been missing, or where there's been a large void, has been thinking about who's buying the tickets, who's going to come listen to me, and what interests them. Why do they want to come listen to me? Ultimately, it has been in questioning what creates a memorable musicking experience. The term musicking comes from an ethnomusicologist named Timothy Small, and it encompasses a musical performance not only from the time the performer picks up their instrument and plays, but it takes into account everything that has gone into that performance. It takes into all the hours that I, as a performer, would have spent in a practice room. It also takes into account the person or stage hands that set up the stands and the music. It takes into account the audience that's here and the energy that you bring to the performance as well. And it doesn't end when the music is over. It ends when the last stand has been struck off the stage. It ends when the last audience member returns home. And it may not ever end. You may have a specific experience that continues to live through that musicking as you recall back to that experience that you had. So I researched by interviewing audience members, because a lot of times I get to just stand in front and think everybody wants to come and listen to me, which is a pretty self-centered way to approach performing. But like I said, I don't really always consider my audience members. And then I was interviewing people to ask them what they experienced through hymns. And one of my participants said, there are hymns that are a hit, and there are hymns that are a miss. If I can connect, it's a hit. If I can't connect, it's a miss. So if we replace hymns with music in general, if an audience member can connect, it's a hit. If they can't connect, it's a miss. So remembering back to the previous slide I had, talking about what I learned, what I've been learning in my current education, these are the kinds of things that I wanted to accomplish when I would be in a practice room. I wanted something that was technically flawless, which is not a bad goal, but that was what I ultimately focused on. I also wanted absolute control of everything that was happening, meaning, again, a very tunnel visioned type experience as I come into a performance space. And that was because perfection meaning without any kind of flaw or mistake, was the most desired part of my performance. But with this new paradigm in mind, what a hit actually is I still want that flawlessness, and I still spend lots of time practicing, but I do it with the mindset that once I get on stage, I trust in what I've prepared, and then I use everything that's gone into that so that I can perform and give back. This is because there's a shared control. Instead of me being in control and me being aware of myself and no one else, I'm aware of everything that's happening, the environment that I'm in, the people that are there, what they respond to. And ultimately, perfection is secondary in perfection without flaw, without something that is wrong or a missed note. Perfection is now defined as something that connects. So my research has two parts. The first part, the research, has a couple sections. One is the spirit, because the spirit applies to hymns. One is musical elements. Hymns have musical elements. It also has textual elements and the history of Protestant hymnody, and last, neuroscience. So all five of these aspects refer to what I have defined as the things that go into hymns that speak to people or that speak to me. And the second part of the research is where I present to you the people that I've interviewed, the experiences that they have shared with me, and the applications of what I learned and how that can apply to myself as a classically performing violist. Before I started this research, I didn't know that there were these similarities to classical music, but after listening to many participants and seeing what their biases were, what their experiences were, I started to see trends in the genre of hymnody that were similar to the genre of classical music that I've not seen before. One of those is that there is a very specific idea of what is approved and appropriate in both classical music and in hymn music. And in hymns, that can be, this is the type of music we sing here, these are the instruments we use or don't use, and this is the correct text that goes with it. In classical music, that can take a lot of different forms. For example, this is the addition we use. These are the bowings that are correct. This is the fingering that is best. A lot of those are very opinionated, as you might imagine, so it's also similar across the board. Another is, I can't tell you how many people I interviewed that were over the age of 50 that commented about how glad they were that I was doing this research because hymns are a dying genre, meaning they only appeal to people from my generation, was what I was getting from them. And if you are a classical musician or if you have any kind of foot in that world, you've probably heard the same thing. Why can't we get people to come to our concerts? Why is there no more interest in the classical music that's there? And I'm not here to argue the validity of that, but it was just a similarity that I saw. And then the last was the inaccessibility of these two genres of music. For hymns, sometimes the archaicness of the language that is used and also the repetitiveness of the music, some people they're not necessarily drawn to that, not a huge appreciation for it, so it can seem inaccessible. For classical music, sometimes, in a performance space, for example, there's a lot of unspoken rules that make it inaccessible for someone that may not know those. For example, you clap at this time, you do not clap at another time. You are supposed to wear a certain outfit, you come to a fancy concert hall. If you haven't been exposed to that, it can seem a little intimidating and inaccessible. The intended audiences of this research, obviously performers, as I've stated. Another is churchgoers. I would think that they would find interest in what I have researched and how it applies to their church experience and their worship experience. And then any individual who has an interest in the process of musicking and how they're experiencing music. So the first of the research part, I've asked the question, what is the purpose of a hymn? And a couple of these are to worship, to inspire, to express what cannot be spoken, to unify, to educate, but most importantly, from a musical standpoint, to invite the Spirit. What does that mean? What are we inviting here? Well, the Spirit, as defined in Romans chapter 8, verse 16, it says, the Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. So what this is saying is that the Spirit himself, meaning a deistic being, or God, is testifying with us, the part of us that is not our body, but that makes us who we are. And there is a non-verbal type of communication that is occurring. So that is what the Spirit is. If you go back and think in your head when I talked about that quote from the research participant, and they talked about if it's a hit, I connect. That connection is the Spirit. That's what that connection is. Now, is that possible with hymns? Spirit is drawing the Spirit is the only, as far as I can tell, is the biggest goal that you want. That's why you're playing this music. That's why you're singing this music. That's why you're participating in it. This is applicable to classical performance because while there may not be one specific goal, knowing what that goal is informs you as a performer so that you can then carry it out. When I get up to perform a hymn, I know what my goal is, and so I achieve that. As a classical musician, it is useful to know that as well, which I may not have always been interested in finding out or thinking about. So, what musical elements contribute to bringing the Spirit? There's a lot of different things that can contribute, but the ones that I am going to focus on are intervals, musical intervals, and what kind of emotional effect they can have. Key signatures, and how they can affect our emotions. And then the instruments that are used to perform. So, with intervals, I'm going to take that back so I don't distract you. There is a performer, professional flautist, as well as musical therapist, who interviewed a bunch of workshop participants because she wanted to know how specific intervals felt to them and what kind of emotions they evoked. And so she took her participants and she played different intervals for them and then asked them to give her feedback. So a unison, for example, do, do. She played that and people said, well, I feel strength, solidity, security, and calmness. Then she played do, do, which is an octave. And the type of emotions that they described were completeness, openness, togetherness, and it sounded circulatory to them. She went to the perfect fifth, which is do, sol, and they described that as powering, centering, sturdy, comfortable, and complete. She went all the way through from unison to octave. I'm not going to show all of those to you. But she also took these wavelengths and put them in an oscilloscope, which is a mechanism that reads musical wavelengths. And when you play a unison, so two pitches that are exactly the same, it creates a circle. This is what came out when she played an octave, a perfect fifth, and as the intervals got more complex, so did the drawings. An interesting visual. Also something you can think about. What would I feel when I see something like that? So a practical application of this I have on the left. This is out of a hymnal for the text, Come Ye Disconsolate. And it sounds like this. Come ye disconsolate. And then over here, I have another musical arrangement of this hymn. And it goes like this. Come ye disconsolate. They have a very different impact when you listen to them. So let me take the text out and I will just sing you the pitches. This is first over here, I'll sing these ones. La 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 la. And then over here. La 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 la. When I hear the one on the right, it sounds very trite to me. Over here it is outlining a major triad, da da da, which tells us what key we're in, but it doesn't really do much for me emotionally. Over here, this composer specifically chose to jump an octave from ye to dis, starting the word disconsolate. Disconsolate is when you need to be comforted, and that jump down in that pitch shows that fallingness. However, if you think back to that diagram, an octave followed by a unison, as you can see here, E to a B, is open and sturdy and comforting. And so that is where those intervals were used to evoke that emotion. So next are key signatures. This is something that has been studied throughout history. Over here I have two composers from the Baroque era, Charpentier and Matheson. And I put them next to Schubert, who came a century later. And this is just to show you that regardless of time in history, and regardless of them being contemporaries, sometimes these key signatures showed a different emotion. The reason that this is important to me is that as a performer, it's very good to be reminded that people react differently. Even musicians that are trained, they react differently to the music that they hear. So as you can see, C major for Schubert was completely pure, innocent, simple, naive. For Matheson, it was rude and impudent. And for Trevor Deere, it was gay and warlike. Three very, very different reactions to the same key signature and music that was written there. C minor and D major have a lot of similarities. C minor is obviously sad or unhappy. D major is more warlike and joyful. However, again, to show you just how different emotions can be within even one particular sound for one person, Matheson down here describes F minor as mild and calm, and then decides that it also causes the listener to shudder with horror. So, lots of different reactions, which again can show that as a performer, I have a lot of control if I want to have it in what I can evoke. Now, another thing that composers have done is associated color with key signatures. This is a really great visual of what I've just explained, which is that people react differently. While there may be trends, there are also people that go against what that trend is. These are musicians, as you know, Isaac Newton played the violin, and it goes through 3 centuries, and there's not necessarily anything that corresponds specifically for one century. It's all diverse. The idea of putting color to sound waves, to music, is actually scientifically proven as well. Kay Gardner, the person that I showed you about the intervals, she said that when moving from audible sound waves to visible light waves that produce the color spectrum, we must jump 40 octaves. Once there, we move from the basic rainbow sequence, red, orange, yellow, green, sky blue, indigo, and violet, to the next octave of finer and more pastel vibrations, rose, peach, pale and yellow, pistachio green, pale blue, light indigo, and lavender, and so on up through the octaves. For those of you that's like blowing your mind right now, we give you more of a visual. So down here, audio waves are in hertz. If you jump 40 octaves to where you no longer hear that pitch but you see it, it's read in angstroms. A440 is, if you've ever been to an orchestra concert, everyone tunes to that pitch. And A440 falls around orange. And as I'm sure you can imagine, these colors also are different than some of those people from that chart that I just showed you. So they don't necessarily correspond with what an emotional response is versus what the scientific response is. And last is instrumentation. Different ranges can correspond with different parts of our body and how it affects us or where it affects us. What I have here are the 8 ranges of the voice, the human voice. Kay Gardner believes that if you start with the human voice, it is centered in your heart. And then when you move from there, from that range, if you go higher on your body, it resonates physically higher. If that range is lower, it physically resonates lower. For example, the flute, a very high instrument, would resonate somewhere in your forehead. A tuba would resonate somewhere below your hips. So the reason that instrumentation is important is that as a performing artist, you need to know what type of benefits your instrument has to carry across to your audience and how you can use those to be a positive experience for your performer. Or for your audience, I'm sorry. And instrumentation I bring up also because hymns have a history of using specific instruments and not using others. So perhaps there was some recognition of this for that. There's not necessarily documentation for that, but. So then hymns obviously have text. As a classical violist, I don't get to rely on text to tell my story, which can be a good thing or it can inhibit an experience, a musical experience. As I mentioned, the text of hymns, it's interesting because modern scripture that is used when you are in church in general has been translated out of the Old English style. There are lots of options available, and hymns haven't followed that trend. They still use thee and thou, and they also assume that you know or have a basic knowledge in order for the text to affect you. Fount, for example, is referring to Jesus Christ, who in the New Testament is often referred to as the living water. In the second verse, here I raise my Ebenezer is a reference specifically to 1 Samuel, when the Philistines and the Israelites were at war. And then to show, as an example of the archaicness of the language that we might not relate to, a fetter, when Robert Robinson wrote this in the 1800s, was a very common term for shackles. But none of us know that. So, what kind of influence does the text have on us as we listen? What I'm going to do now is perform one hymn with you without text, and then I will put this slide up so that you can see it, and you can decide. Now, you don't know, you may not know, where this text lines up with the music that I'm playing, and you may know. Regardless of whether you know where that goes, you can read it and see what that is informing of what your experience is and what it's talking about. So the first hymn that I'll play for you is called King's Fold. Both of these hymns are transcriptions of pieces of music that I've been encouraged to develop my artistic voice with, so I've actually transcribed them myself. And yeah, so the first one is King's Fold, and then I'll follow it with Come Thou Fount. And I'm going to turn this off so it doesn't distract me. Thank you. So I'm sure that you felt a lot of different things, and it was not completely related only to the text. As we've seen, there are musical keys. There were obviously two very different moods that were evoked by those arrangements, but the text does have an effect, and that is part of it. And I wanted to know that to inform my classical performance, because as a violist, I have felt a very akin relationship to my ability to communicate with my audience through hymns, and I wanted to see if that was possible, or if it was only because of the text, or only because of the type of music that was there. So I want to explain to you a bit about the history of hymns. As a classical performer, I mentioned that I've spent a lot of time in music history classes, and that's because that informs the way that I perform. And so I want to inform you about hymns and their history so that you have that context. And it is important for me as a performer to know that, because then I can decide if I want to adhere to a specific rule or not, that maybe I envision being important with hymns, and maybe it's just a historical context type thing. So a little bit about me. My church experience has been almost completely in a traditional worship music service. This means that we sang hymns out of a green hymnal that had 346 pages in it, accompanied by an organ or a piano. The only instruments that were allowed in our services for special music in general were string instruments or woodwind instruments that weren't too loud. While things are beginning to change, in general, it was not allowed to have a brass instrument in our worship service. Maybe in other church meetings, but not for that. So I had this idea of specific instruments being the right ones to play hymns, being the approved and the appropriate way. And all of these guidelines to how to experience hymns and what was appropriate to bring the Spirit is written in a church handbook. Anything in general that was not coming out of our hymnal with those 346 pages needed special approval from church leadership. And this led me to question some things because I remember the first time I picked up a hymnal from a different denomination, and there were over 700 pages of it. And I just went like this because I love hymns. And I thought, wow, I'm like a kid in a candy shop. This is so exciting. So I was elated. And then I also remember the first time I went to a worship service with a friend where there was a guitar plugged into an amplifier and a drum set. And it was very overwhelming to me the first time I experienced that. So it led me to question, are my musical biases a result of my religious conditioning, or are they truly my experience? I also thought, is a specific genre of music more worshipful than another? Are there really specific instruments that bring the Spirit or that allow that connection? I don't know. And what qualifies music as being appropriate or inappropriate? Now, if you think back to those diagrams that I showed you about those colors, it's interesting to consider that maybe there's a lot of options. Just like there's a lot of colors on the chart for one specific key signature, there might also be the same truth. So, history of Protestant hymnody. Most hymnals that you pick up today relate back to this history that I'm going to give to you. There were two religious awakenings in Europe and New England. The first took place, started around 1730 to 1740, which was mostly a reactivation effort, which led to the Second Great Awakening in the 1790s, which was evangelizing. All those reactivated members now went out and shared the gospel, and church leadership, membership completely, I guess, exploded, is a good way to put it. So this came with changes in the worship service. One of the things that happened is that churches moved outside of formal big church buildings with an organ, and they started proselytizing to the poor of society, the people that may not have been accepted previously in a church house, and they met in fields. There's no organs in fields. So text-only hymnals came from this period, meaning they all sang a cappella, which required a type of singing called lining out. This is what a page looks like, and when you line out a hymn, I would sit up here, I don't know this one specifically, so I'll sing one that I know, but I would say, nearer my God to thee, and everybody would repeat, nearer my God to thee, and then we'd come back and do that, going through the hymnal. Now, this is a great way to learn. Hymns were huge in missionary work because they taught the doctrine of the church, of the specific denomination that was taking it through, probably even more than scripture because people remembered these. They were catchy, and they had tunes that they were familiar with. But there were problems. The problem is with lining out, it's a lot like jazz music. When you're repeating it back, especially in a congregation, you feel very free to impose your personal interpretation of what that is. And clergymen at this time were not impressed. They said music had fallen to a place where it was musically tortured and twisted and quavered, in some churches into an horrid medley of confused and disorderly noises. A contemporary of this pastor, his name was Walter Thomas, a contemporary said that music had fallen into degeneracy, and that the ridiculous ideas of the people have turned the singing of psalms into odd noise, a confused noise, an uncouth noise. The clergymen were so upset with where this music was going and how it was not connecting the Spirit the way that they deemed appropriate, that they published pamphlets. This is the title of one of those pamphlets, which I am not going to read to you because it is insane, but that's how big of a deal this was. So how do you control something that you don't have any control over? You print the music, and you tell people how to sing it, and you show them what's appropriate and what's approved and what is going to bring the Spirit. So this is an example of the next type of hymnal that happened. And down here we have 5 different texts that go with this specific hymn tune. And the idea behind this is that you choose the text that goes with the message that you are going to give to the people. It was great because there's only one correct printed way, and there's specified harmonization. Really awesome ideas until you realize that nobody knows how to read music. So, what do? You hire a professional musician to come in and teach your congregation how to read music, how to sing, and they did that. Hymnals from this period have 20 plus pages of music theory lessons. This is one example, and you can see it's pretty, I think it was very advanced. They've got all 3 clefs in here, people are learning how to read music and count. And if that's not enough, then there's another, 28 ways that you're supposed to do this the correct way. These are all suggestions of how to sing correctly, to bring the Spirit. So, but the thing is that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough control because people actually did what they were taught. They became really capable musicians, which made it possible to do really impressive musical things, which was also distracting. And it also allowed them, because now they're trained musicians, they can bring other genres of music into church. So it really backfired on these pastors, and they were on the opposite spectrum. Musicians and pastors alike agreed that this music was not appropriate for this worshipful nature that they wanted in their worship services. And so then came what most of you are probably familiar with when you open a hymnal, which is one text, one tune, and this is how it happens. Now, I show you these publications because as a performer, when I had performed hymns, I always associated a specific text with the music until I learned its history. And then I thought, there's a lot of different ways that the story can be told, which is really exciting. But as you can see, this kind of makes it seem more concrete. This is the tune, this is what goes with this text. So the results of the second musical reform, which I just described, was one text, one tune. Self-interpretation and taste was completely removed. There were no options, there were no optional texts to put in. And it was very, very obvious what was appropriate and approved. Most congregations, most denominations have specific hymnals that were known as their official hymnal, and that started from this. Now, this is going to take us to a completely different place, but when we talk about things spiritual and how they affect us, it seems like there's not a lot to back it up, or something that's concrete. And so I also wanted to know what kind of physiological explanations are there for the way that I am reacting to music and possibly that others react to music. So here I have a diagram of the brain. Down here is considered the lower region of the brain. As you can see, coordination and vision you don't get very far in life without coordination and vision. So those are very basic functions. As you move up in the brain, you have hearing, facial recognition, which requires a memory, like I heard or I saw that expression and it taught me that. Taste, oh, I remember, I don't like that. That does not taste good, right? And then the higher region of the brain, which you need, it creates problem solving, concentration, planning, known as higher functioning parts of the brain. The way that these parts of the brain correspond with our emotions is as follows. You have the primary emotions, seeking, lust, care, rage, fear, panic, and play. These are our basic, rudimentary emotions. When something scares us, we run. When something makes us happy, we laugh, we play. These emotions, if you look here, I'll show you how they evolve. These emotions, primary emotions, through learning of cultural experiences, we gain a memory and the triangle starts to flip. So as adults, we don't hang out in these primary process emotions very much, and we've learned higher brain functions such as naming feelings, mentalization, mindfulness, etc. How I believe that these things apply to audiences as well as performers is that personal sound requires, the universal sound that we are looking for comes from the primary brain function, emotions. So you find a sound that ties into one of those. But the way that it creates a personal sound, if someone hears that, they hear something that makes them feel care or seeking, they seek for something. And they relate that to, oh, I heard this hymn at my grandmother's funeral. It was played there. Now I have these memories and maybe higher functioning brain emotions that associate with that. And I've heard that a lot when people would share their experiences with me. That there was a common emotion, maybe sadness at a funeral, for example, but it also had an association with something else that had happened in the memory of that. So on to the second part of my research, which is letting you get to know the research participants and the practical applications I learned from what they taught me. As I've mentioned, and hopefully you have seen, our responses to music are very diverse. And one of my participants put it this way: we mistakenly make the assumption that just because someone is being moved by a hymn, they are moved in a similar or the same way. And as we've seen, that simply is not true. And it's very easy to make that assumption. I, as a performer, or even as a congregation member, have thought, wow, I'm feeling this, everybody else must be feeling this too, because it's so great. But it's good to remember that that's not necessarily the case. So to let you get to know the people that I interviewed, some of the demographics about them. I interviewed 90 people, 40% were male, 60 were female, and half of them were under the age of 40. And I bring that up because of that first comment I made back at the beginning about people over 50 thinking only those that were in their age group could associate or appreciate hymns, which wasn't the case. The countries that were represented by this research were the United States, Asia, Central America, and Europe. And the religious backgrounds of the participants that I interviewed were all denominations of Christianity, people that define themselves as agnostic, atheist, and Jewish. And while that's interesting, what I found more interesting was how they defined themselves religiously. Some were devout, some were skeptically believing, some were non-believing, and others were spiritual, but not religious. So again, I asked this question: what is the purpose of a hymn? One of my favorite answers was, thank goodness, they finally stopped talking. Hymns were seen as a huge reprieve from all the talking that was happening. Thank you, I can stand up, I can use my voice, I'm not going to fall asleep anymore. But one person really hit it on the head. Again, it can have a spectrum of meanings and purposes for people, and that is because of the personal experiences and the histories of what they've had, or perhaps the emotion that is put into a performance that they've experienced. And then these are the things that I have already spoken to you about when I introduced this in the beginning. I asked participants if they'd ever had any negative experiences because, for two reasons. Classical music doesn't always have a happy message to it. It's used to express a lot of very deep emotions, which I think that hymns are too, but in general, when we go to a worship service, or when we are singing something that is associated with worship, we think of God, we think happy, and I wanted to know if it was possible for me to apply this to all of my classical performances and not just the happy ones. So people were actually quite accepting of the shortcomings of performers of hymns. They mentioned discomfort at choir performance, discomfort when they were learning a new hymn, perhaps if they didn't read music, and possibly boredom. But I wouldn't categorize these as negative. They also sometimes felt social pressure, maybe to raise their hands, or to shout a hallelujah, or something of the sort. But again, not as we would define negative, it was just kind of something uncomfortable. Other people had issues with the warlike texts, which is something I hadn't thought about before, but they didn't like how that associated back to Crusades and Christianity and the things that it had brought from there. But again, not super negative. The only thing that I found participants feeling negative about was when they were in spiritual distress because the text was teaching them something or telling them to believe a specific way that they were not in agreement with. So in that case, the text was a huge informant of what the emotional experience was. But otherwise, it was not necessarily the most important thing. More questions that I asked. Are you more moved by the text or by the music? There were participants that thought the music was more meaningful to them, or the text was more meaningful, but almost 100% across the board, if you did not have both, they did not have the same effect. So it is necessary for them both to be there. That is what makes the hymn. I asked if hymns are unique, if the genre of hymns is unique, and the reason I asked this question is because I wanted to apply it to classical music. Can I have that same effect that I have when I perform a hymn, when I'm performing something by Vivaldi? Some people said that it was unique, and it was because of the spiritual nature of it. Others actually mentioned how closely they had been moved by a piece of classical music in a similar way to hymns. So it goes back to those similarities that I spoke about in the beginning of things that I had seen. Listeners, trained musicians, music appreciators, someone that's tone deaf, they recognized that. And so that was exciting to me because there was a very direct application of how an audience member could be moved. I asked if your religious background was an influence because I wanted to know if the power of the music transcended the knowledge of spirituality or of religious practice. And while, again, most people agreed that their religious background definitely influenced their experience, they also agreed that it can move people that do not have that same background or any background at all. I asked physical responses because I know how I feel when I'm performing and the emotions that are being evoked in me, and I wanted to know if that is what other people feel as well. And I would say that the universal sign of hymns is this. When I was looking at them, most people would either say, I weep, or they go like this. Which, if you think back to that slide that I had about the voice, and I mentioned that the voice is here around the heart, it's an interesting correlation. I asked about the environment because environment seems to be something that is relatively consistent in classical performance. And in hymnody, you would generally associate it with a church. However, I would say at least half of the experiences that people shared with me were not in a church, which again was very exciting because there is a possibility to bring the power of that music and that text and put it in a different place. And that's exactly what this research participant said. He said, I think as humans, there are aesthetics that are more pleasing to us, but once you begin an experience, I think the experience takes over the aesthetic. This I took to heart as an artist, as a musician, because I have a lot of control over that. If I can create an aesthetic that is more important than the environment that you are in, then I've really done my job. So, in closing, the role of the performer, how does the Spirit inform us? Like I mentioned, the Spirit in hymns is the purpose. That's what they are there for, is to invite that. So as a classical performer, I need to know what my purpose is, whether it is to connect with a specific story and be the narrator of that, or if I want to evoke a specific emotion, or if I need to tell someone else's story. The musical and textual elements in hymns inform a lot, and the combination of them do that. What I used that information to inform as I am being a classical performer was the text might inform the music, but I can create a text or a story that I want to evoke, tell, and that is how I can use that music to connect with other people. And then the history of Protestant hymnody, as I explained it to you, I found that it's very applicable to classical music in the sense that sometimes we do things because that is what they did. Baroque music, for example, was played a specific way, but then you take into account that instruments were completely different at that time. The bows were in an arc like this. The bows today are in an arc like this. And they played on gut strings instead of steel strings. And so just like understanding the history of hymns and understanding that they weren't always associated with one specific text and one specific piece of music, but that they were actually very interchangeable like folk music, just like that is applicable in understanding how you sing and experience hymns, understanding the history of classical music and the piece that you're performing is very useful, and it gives you the opportunity to make a choice. For example, for me, any instrument would be worshipful, because if it's played well and if it has a specific story that it wants to tell, then it's going to tell that story. And so for me as a classical musician, when I am choosing to play a piece of music, I can keep that in mind and then make choices. Sometimes I will be true to the text and true to what the composer said, and sometimes I may make an artistic decision instead and have a good reason for that. And then the neuroscience, find an emotion that speaks to everybody, and then they can connect that to something that is personal as well. And the last thing that I learned was it's not always about me. One of the things that I really appreciated about a lot of people that I interviewed was I asked them if they had heard a really good performance but then not been moved by it. And many people said yes. And sometimes it's because of me. Sometimes it's because I'm just not in a place to receive what's being told. And that was a huge relief and a huge reminder as a performer that I can do everything that I want or that I hope will connect with an audience, and sometimes they're just not in a place where that is useful to them or where they can receive that. And so those are all of the things that I learned with hymns. And so in closing, I'm going to perform one more arrangement of 2 hymns that I put together, and then you can ask me questions after. So does anybody have any questions? It's okay if you don't. Yeah.
As you interviewed people, did you meet anybody who said they kind of came to know God through music? That they weren't a believer and then they became a believer as a result of a musical experience?
I didn't have anyone that mentioned that. I did interview one person specifically that had been atheist for 18 years of their life and then converted. And they mentioned that when they heard hymns before, they thought it was beautiful music, but it didn't have any meaning past that. And then when they converted, it had a very different meaning. The musical effect was only associated with the text in those instances. They still felt the same beauty and appreciation for the music in both instances. But yeah, no, I didn't find anybody with that. Yes.
The one slide that was talking about the response, or where the comment you made was, "Oh, finally they quit talking and we can hear them."
Yeah.
I felt that one of the things that wasn't on that slide was the ability to participate themselves, as opposed to just be listening. Did that come into it?
Absolutely, yes. That was something that was very important for most people in their experience, was the appreciation to be a part of that voice of worship. Yeah, a lot of people mentioned that. Yes. Oh, yes.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this. Thank you. I was wondering, kind of piggybacking on that question. You've laid out a history of hymns and their text, and drawn some great parallels between that and classical music. But thinking of the participation aspect of hymns, I'm wondering if you think there are similar shared elements between perhaps playing a classically based arrangement of a song that people have participated with in another, be it elementary school or social setting, that it's another song, a non-religious song that they know, if it has similar effects. What you would think about that?
Yeah, I've definitely thought about things like that. I teach for an El Sistema program of music, which for those of you who don't know what that means, it means you create music for social change, and there's no such thing as private lessons. So you learn music together in a big group of people, and that's how you learn. So it's very similar to that participatory, we're all singing together, and there are very, very noticeable differences between those children that I teach in that versus the ones that I see once a week for 30 minutes and teach them. So I would, while I haven't been able to go explore that, I have seen something similar to that because we've played all genres of music in that. So yeah, definitely something that's interesting that I would love to know more about. Yes?
I'm curious to know, now that you've gone through this process of this research, if you come to any conclusions yourself about what you prefer. Do you prefer playing music without text? Because you've created a lot of editions from hymns that are now represented without text.
Right.
And so I'm curious to know how you feel about that as a performer.
Yeah, so one of the things that I really loved about several people that I spoke with hymns was the people that, one person said it this way, they said they wrote really great music and then they ruined it with words. And I laughed at that, but it was because they thought that they wanted the comfort of what hymns give musically, but they didn't want to be told what it was that they were supposed to be feeling. And so for me, my preference, you're asking with or without text, right? What my preference is?
Yeah.
I think it depends on the hymn. For example, the first hymn that I played for you tonight, as I have gone and researched, there's multiple texts that are associated with that tune that I love, and I've actually prefer them more than the text that I knew when I first learned that piece of music. And so for that specific song, I prefer not to think of the text because I have so many different shared experiences with it, and it's also a piece that's been used by classical composers, by Vaughan Williams, for example, who wrote a theme and variations on that tune. And so I've had lots of meaningful, memorable experiences performing that on stage, where the text was most likely not associated with it. But Come Thou Fount is an example of one that I relate very strongly to the text of that, and so I prefer the text to be going through my head as I'm playing it. So it just depends. Yeah.
So if I could follow up to ask, how does that then affect how you prepare classical pieces?
So
because to some degree we're still telling a story.
right.
The story is not provided to the audience. So then so what's your process, having gone through all of this, to understand more clearly?
It has reminded me, the text is something that has reminded me very strongly when I'm preparing classical music now, that there are certain phrases that are very important that I would almost always pass over. So finding those little nuggets and those carrots that you can pull out and say something really important, I didn't necessarily do that before. And having a text that I was specifically thinking of when I had a phrase helped me to go about the music that way, and then I did start to carry that into my classical performance, and it made me enjoy it more too, because I now had a very personal connection and I felt strongly about what I was saying instead of trying to play it the way that this professional performer had on the recording or doing it the correct way, which I felt very stifled by for a very long time. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much for being here, and thanks for listening.